Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this afternoon on Grant Ready, Planning, Positioning, and Preparing for Success. My name is Adrienne Harris. I'm a Strategic Services Consultant with RGS for grants, and I'm joined by...
I'm Glenn Lasloff. I am a strategic services consultant for RGS as well, and the director of our finance services service line.
When organizations are looking for grants training, a lot of time I see them focused on training about grants writing, or they are thinking about wanting to win grants. And we're encouraging you to think with a broader lens. Applying is just one piece of the overall process with grants. Now, it's an important piece, but it is a small piece of that. We think equally important is deciding whether to apply and how to ensure success when you get it.
Duran, why does grant readiness matter?
I feel one of the worst things you can do is apply for a grant and then mess it up. I think it's better to not apply. I tell my clients that your reputation is a huge factor in whether you are able to be competitive for a grant application. So don't undermine your ability to get that next grant.
So really, what I'm hearing is you're advising people to save their energy and resources for their best opportunities.
Absolutely. So we're going to jump into a bunch of content to share with you today. And before we jump in, I just want everyone to know that there's a Q&A section in this webinar. Feel free to pop your questions in there as we go. We'll get to them at the end. And Nancy is in the background joining us and can answer any technical problems you have during the webinar. So Glenn and I feel that as you're assessing whether you're ready to apply, there's 4 questions that you should ask yourself. Do you have a well-defined project? Do you know what your budget is? Do you have solid budget numbers? Do you have a realistic timeline? Are your partners at the table and agreeing to be part of the process? And do you have community buy-in?
Well,
Is
you're
it
actually suggesting that what people do is not create the project for the grant because there's funds available, but to already have a project in mind.
Yes, I think that is the better approach. Plenty of people do it the other way, but I think you should know what your key projects are and go find funding to match them. Is there priority for your organization and funders? Does this project align with your CIP? Does it align with state plans? Are you going to be able to manage this once you get it? Do you have the right financial and communication systems in place? And do you have the people capacity to get it done? Are you going to be able to maintain it? A number of grants have a requirement for how long the project is going to be maintained. That could be 10, 20, 30-year time horizons. And make sure that you have adequate record keeping so it's easy to report on your grant. So I know everybody wants to know how they can boost their competitiveness with grant writing. So here are a couple things that you can do before you even start writing that will really help you. 1, know the funding landscape. Whoops, sorry about that. Um, Learn what agencies are funding the kind of projects that you want to do. What are those agencies' priorities, and are they overlapping with yours? So when you find some promising funders, make sure you monitor what they're doing, monitor the opportunities that they have out there, know the due dates, and be ready. A number of these grant pots are annual or biannual, so you can watch them and figure out when the best time to apply is for your organization. On the lifetime of your project, maybe it might wait. It might be most beneficial to wait 1 or 2 years before you actually apply for the funding. So say if you're a water agency, you're going to want to know what kind of funding pots Department of Water Resources has and Water Resources Conservation Board, and follow those. Make sure you have a well-planned project. I mentioned this at the beginning. I'm going to mention a lot. Make sure it's ready. Make sure that your match is locked in. Some organizations, we said, will plan their project kind of at the same time that they're trying to write their grant. And that is just a recipe for things falling through the cracks. I worked with a client once that scrambled and put together their project and sent it in, and they got awarded funding, but they were relying on match from a partner agency. And when they got the funding and went to the partner agency and said, okay, we need our match now, that agency wasn't really prepared to give them the match that they had said they'd promised. So collaborate early and often with your partners, in particular local and regional partners. Most funders really value multi-partner projects and they want to see who's at the table. They also want to see that there's broad community support for your work. Um, and some grants even require you to prove that in your application process. For example, I was working with a city that was applying for active transportation plan funds through Caltrans. And those of you on the webinar today, if you've applied for those funds before, you know they're super competitive. You normally have to score a 92 or a 95 or out of 100 or above in order to get the grant in the cycle. And I feel that this client really was able to kind of get their project up above that bar because they had great evidence of community support. And they got that by working with their local partners. Their local nonprofit partners helped go out and get information from the community, both in Spanish and English, that they were able to put on their grant application and show very strong support and need for the project. So that also speaks to having the good data and figures to back up the story that you're telling in your application. Quantitative information about the need of your project can be really critical.
Would you recommend that folks begin to gather some of the standard grant application materials even before they've actually decided on a funding source or looked for a particular grant? For example, letters of support, um, biograph biographies of key staff, project budgets, possible stakeholders, even demographics for the project area.
I think that that can be helpful. Sometimes these turnarounds for grants, you only have about a month or two to pull things together. So whatever you can have at your fingertips to be ready can be super beneficial. But it's not just about a well-planned project. You also have to think about strategic alignment. Funders look for alignment between your project and approved city, regional, state, and even national plans if you're looking for federal funds. Um, so you want to see how your priorities align with priorities set forth in state plans and national policies. Grants are just a way for agencies to further their mission. So if you're going after transportation project grant, you're probably going to want to go check out Caltrans strategic plan and make sure that some of the priorities that Caltrans are pushing align with the work that you want to do. You want to think about who in your community supports it. And do you have evidence of this community support? You want to make sure that you have up-to-date infrastructure and strategic plans that support the need for your project so you can fall back on that in your storytelling.
That reminds me of an agency I was working with once. Um, they believed that they had a capital improvement plan uh, that they've had at the agency for some time. And as we got closer and closer to implementing it, we took a look at it and we realized that that plan had become so outdated that with the staff turnover at that agency, there was nobody there who really felt like they owned the numbers in the plan or even the schedule of even some of the actual improvements. So we really had to very late in the game back up and start over and build that basic building block of a capital improvement plan.
Yeah, yeah. But, if you're building your capital improvement plan, whether it's maybe a little bit later than you planned, try to build in flexibility into that plan to be able to capitalize on grant funding can be incredibly beneficial and helpful.
I'm working with another agency that they had a major building rehabilitation that they needed to fund, and they didn't have all the funding that they needed, but they left some elements unfunded. But they were very strategic about what they didn't fund. They identified attractive elements of the building rehab, such as they needed ADA to meet ADA requirements. They had a leaky roof. They're a library, and they had to protect their collection. Those kinds of things were really attractive, and they were able to get a congressional earmark for that. So being strategic in what's unfunded can be really helpful.
Yeah, and you might need more than one grant to piece it together to put that project together. And earmarks can really round out that funding portfolio.
So another thing we really want to talk about is think well ahead about the upcoming grant project that you have in mind and identifying clear roles in your organization and who's going to be accountable for all the different pieces. You're going to have to, if you're doing a public works project, you're going to have project managers and people that know construction involved. You're going to have a procurement department, and keep in mind with procurement, your agency, you may have procurement within departments. You may have a centralized procurement office, but keep in mind that your agency's procurement processes might be less restrictive than those of the funder. And you're going to need your procurement people to comply with the most restrictive of the two. So, do you have an understanding of how all those folks are going to work together? Who's going to report to the funding sources? There are always periodic reports, project reports, and also financial reports. How are those going to be gathered? Think about the timeline. Um, you're going to give your funders an expectation of when reports are going to be done, when projects are going to be finished, and how much time is going to go into maintaining the project when it's complete. Um, you just can't emphasize enough, I think, the need to begin that collaboration early, especially with the finance department, because they're the ones that are going to have to keep the financial documentation together to verify that the monies from the funding source were used properly. Um, and another question that's really interesting is sometimes the leadership is going to be pushing for a grant, but the department isn't necessarily on board. Adrian, you have a story about that, don't you?
I do, I had a client that their board of supervisor wanted very much to apply to a very specific grant for a project. But that project wasn't in the work plan for the department. It wasn't something that was on their radar to be working on in that time. But they also didn't feel comfortable enough going to have that tough conversation with their elected about their workflow and work process and what seemed feasible at the time. They ended up applying for the grant. They didn't get it, which maybe is a good thing because they just weren't really ready to be working on that project yet. I've also seen the flip side where so Prop 4 money just came out. And that's going to be a great pot of money to fund stormwater and climate readiness and a bunch of other initiatives in the state of California. And so there was some department level staff were really excited about the stormwater money that's in that. They thought, this is great. We can fund some of these projects that have kind of been sitting here that we haven't had a chance to do. And but their leadership was feeling grant fatigue. They were feeling like their staff were overworked and they just didn't want to apply for any more grants. So again, you need to have those conversations. Is it worth taking on what could be extra workload for money that's here now to fund these kinds of projects that will maybe go away over time?
And the last part of internal buy-in, but an important one is the grantor is going to have contract language. And is your attorney going to be okay with the contract language? Sometimes attorneys have a lot of priorities and they don't do things as quickly as we want. So the earlier you can get in the process, you can get that contract language over to them, get their buy-in, the more it's going to serve you in meeting application deadlines.
Yeah, and luckily, a lot of funders will post on their website what their draft contract language looks like. So when you're sitting down to think about whether you want to apply, you can look at that and share it with everybody on your team that needs to see it.
So, another important part of this, remember that with the funder is going to want proof, documentation that all the funds were spent on the items that you have stated you would be using them for. And your finance department does this all the time. They are able to link the expenditure, with the invoices, and with the documentation. So it's your finance department is going to be really key in assisting you in putting together the grant and maintaining it and meeting requirements. Your I've looked at the list of attendees, and most of you are in cities or counties where you probably have a pretty good financial system in place that has the ability to track grant projects and grant funds. Um, it's still useful to talk to your finance department about how what their system's capabilities are, what they'll need from you. And remember, one of the most important resources is the time of finance staff. Make sure that they're able to make that commitment, that they can help you so that you can report timely and accurately. Um, a lot of times grants do not have as much funding for these kinds of administrative activities as are necessary. And it's really important to have those dialogues with your finance department ahead of time. We'd like to see a centralized grant management system. And as I said, many of you probably have one in place already at your agency. But if you're in a smaller agency and you don't have a centralized grant management system, especially because maybe this is your first grant, it's not that difficult to have a centralized in the sense of one person who has everything that's required to be able to make the proper representations to your funder. Know who's going to track the grant awards, who's going to ensure that you've met the reporting requirements. Um, Keep it all in one place. Do you have the ability to use unique project or grant codes in the accounting system to help separate the costs? Um, Keep in mind that documentation, your funder may require you to retain your documentation longer than your agency retention policies. So make sure that you know that the proper folks are aware of how long they have to hold on to documentation. And another important thing is, a lot of agencies need to get grants advance payments before the expenditure because they don't have the cash flow to support the progress and ask for reimbursement. With advances, you have to make sure that there are protocols in place to avoid commingling your grant funds with other funding streams. And all this that I'm talking about is really to prepare you for at the end of a grant project, nearly every funder, certainly your federal and state funders, they want to do a closeout audit. They want to come and they want to look and make sure that all of the expenditures were in accordance with the grant and that you can document such. And I can't stress enough, document such, because it's not enough to have the report filed. You've got to be able to have the backup that shows this invoice was paid for this purpose to this vendor, and that this was vendor was obtained through the proper procurement process.
So let's keep digging into these questions of, are we able to manage it? Are we able to maintain it? And think about the whole life cycle of a grant project, from application to implementation to reporting, closeout, and maintenance. It's really important to know the fine print of your grant contracts. We mentioned earlier, a lot of times agencies will post draft contracts on their website so you can look at those even before you apply, so you can know what the requirements are for this particular grant. There might be CEQA requirements. If you're thinking about federal money, that means NEPA might apply. Do you want to take that on? Do you want to have to do NEPA in addition to CEQA? And do you have the budget to do that? There might be prevailing wage requirements, Buy America requirements. If you're going to be building something, putting something in place physical, then there's probably some signage requirements because granting agencies want to, get credit for giving you money. Um, there might be pre-approval requirements for contracts or subawards. They might have a very specific way of how they want you to document match, both cash and in kind. They might have caps on how much money you can spend on program management or caps on the indirect rate that you can apply to a specific grant. Just be ready to follow all of the requirements.
And keep in mind, in terms of getting ready ahead of time, some of these grants are going to have pages of requirements. Don't be intimidated, but read through them. And the,
Reporting. Oh, go ahead,
Mhm.
Glenn. Were you going to add something?
No, no, go ahead.
Well, so reporting, I think we're both wanting to tell you how important reporting is, to make sure that you have the capacity to do it in a timely manner. Glenn, what else did you want to say about that?
Well, that's what I wanted to say. Be really careful about reporting and that you don't sour your reputation. Uh, you know, agencies, a lot of your funding sources see late or incomplete reporting as a red flag, and they will start asking more questions. If you turn in good reports ahead of schedule that are clear, where the information in the financial report lines up well with the narrative, you're going to get a lot fewer questions from most funding sources about how you're doing. If they notice that there's a disassociation, that the timing is bad, that reports are late, um, it raises red flags with your grant officer at the funding source.
And remember, I talked about reputation at the beginning of the webinar. Turning your reports in on time definitely helps your reputation with those funders. It's not so easy to plan for staffing for grant-funded projects. When you turn in an application, you don't know if you're going to get it or not. But think through how you might staff it if you do get the money. So again, we talked about reporting. That means plan for like A plus record keeping over time. Make sure that you can pull the information you need quickly because getting quick reports in means you get reimbursed quicker. And think about record keeping over time when it comes to turnover. If you think about the timeline of this whole life cycle of the grant from application to closeout, it could be 3, 5 years of time. And are you going to have a project lead change during that time? Maybe. Make sure that your record keeping processes can handle turnover. Think about your maintenance plan for the project. I mentioned that you sometimes have to, grant requirements are saying you need to take care of the project for 10, 20 years. How are you going to do that? What money and funding sources are you going to do to maintain that? Grants are really good at giving you money to do something new, not so good at giving you money to maintain things. When you apply for a grant, sometimes they will actually ask you to tell them what your maintenance plan is going to be before they even decide to give you the money.
A lot of what we're saying can be understood by remembering to not think of a grant as free money. What's really happening is that your funder has their own mission that they want to further, and your grant is helping them. And all of this is all about helping to assure the funder that as you did in your application, you're going to help them carry out their mission and that you can document that. And that's really going to help that keeping that as a guiding force is going to really help you as you think about how you're going to administrate this grant.
Yeah. And with a little forethought, you can be very successful. Glenn and I wanted to share with you our top 5. We're going to apply mistakes to make sure that those of you on this webinar don't make these mistakes. So some of the things that we see are 1, chasing funding over the mission. Applying because the funds are available, maybe not because the project is a priority, uh, or the project is ready, um, or the project is even maybe necessarily really aligned with what's the main priority of the organization. So just make sure, think about what your priorities are, and then go find the money.
Bringing in the finance department, especially, and your other agency stakeholders in after the application, not before. Not having a good plan for reimbursements, for timing, understanding cash flow, not having your accounting system set up, not having the personnel in the finance department ready. I can't tell you how upsetting and discouraging it can be when you go into your finance department with this exciting news that you've just got a grant funded and they're looking at it going, "You want us to do what?" When you put the grant together, be careful not to overpromise. You want that grant application to be attractive. And so the temptation is always there to make it sound good by, um, as to when it will get done and how you're going to do it and who your partners are. But make sure that you really do have that together. Remember that your timetables, they're going to want to see you stick to a timetable as to when projects are going to be delivered. If you are doing a project on your own land, property that your agency owns, they're going to often ask to see the title, and you'd be surprised how often an agency doesn't actually have the paper that demonstrates the clear title to their property. It might have been bought 100 years ago. Make sure you have things that you need in order for the plan, and just don't promise unrealistic results. Work with your stakeholders in the agency so that what you're doing is doable and is realistic.
Underestimating time, cost, staffing, or administrative burden. Permitting takes time. Make sure that you're realistically factoring that into your schedule. Project cost increases happen. Make sure you're thinking through where there might be some ahead of time. Um, Make sure that you make a budget that is realistic for your project. Don't say, oh, well, the max ask for this grant is here, so we're going to slide in our request right under that, even if you maybe realistically need more money than that to get your project done. Have a plan for where you're going to find those funds. Think about staff workload and the possibility of burnout. Remember, reporting is not just a side duty. It can actually take a lot of time to report on a grant and manage those funds. And again, plan for turnover. And then number five,
Yeah.
assuming compliance can be figured out later. It's a pre-application decision. Make sure that you know the procurement rules, you know what you need for documentation way before your reporting and audit time. Don't risk having to give back money. So remember, we brought these up at the beginning of our webinar. If we think that if you can answer these four questions, then you're going to be well prepared to sit down and write. So do you have a well-defined project? Is it a priority of your organization and funders? Are you going to be able to manage it? And are you going to be able to maintain it? And when in doubt, wait for the next round or opportunity. So we've been talking a bunch at you about a bunch of different things in this webinar, and I was thinking it would be great to leave you today with at least one thing that you can do right now as soon as you click end the meeting that would help prepare you to be grant ready. Glenn, how would you answer that question?
Oh, what I would suggest is right away, if you have a concept of a project or a more defined even project in mind that you would like to fund with a grant, think carefully about who your internal agency stakeholders will be, the people that will help you put this together, your finance department, your procurement folks. Um, think about that and then gather them together. Go to the break room for 30 minutes, talk about this project, get their input, start to build those personal relationships so that you have an ongoing team eventually when you're ready to complete the application that can take a look at the application or are just ready to evolve into the team that are going to help you have a successful grant project.
Yeah, I think that can be very helpful. I think how I'd answer that question is um, think about what your key projects are right now that you want to get done. And then go look to see what state agencies are pushing for that kind of work and see if you can sign up for their newsletter and get signed up because that's how you're going to hear when they're opening up grant pots of funding for that work. So that's what we had to share with you today. We want to answer your questions. Um, Before you leave, Nancy's gonna put in the chat a couple page grant tip sheet for you that you can take away and refer to later. It's a quick highlight of the things that we went over today. She's also going to drop in there a poll for you to ask you how the webinar went. And we'd love your feedback, especially on the services that you might be interested in the future. So again, want to take questions from the Q&A now. But if you leave the webinar today and you have questions later, my contact information is on this slide, and I believe Nancy is going to drop it for me and Glenn in the chat right now.
Yeah. Looking forward to your questions if you have any.
Yep, feel free to put something in the Q&A. You can put it in chat. I think if you raise your hand, I can unmute you.
Great. Thanks, Nancy.
We don't have anybody yet, but maybe they're thinking what questions they might have.
I have a question, Glenn. Um,
Okay.
so if a department is thinking about getting a grant for a project and they want to understand better how to be tracking that money in the future, what kind of questions should they be asking their finance team to make sure that they feel like they're prepared?
Well, I think the first question is, what systems do you have in place to track project costs? Probably for most of these agencies, there's an answer there, but it's good to raise that, know how they work, fight. And another question is, will I have a member of the department assigned to help us with this grant to track costs? Um, Sometimes, if an agent, especially if your agency hasn't had a lot of grants before, um, there might be what we call modules, additions to your software that you either aren't that agency hasn't actually started to use yet, or maybe didn't even purchase. And so, getting ahead of the curve and finding out about those, getting those available, that can be really helpful. Um, some of these software systems, many of them that most of you have, are so thorough. And if you get them set up from the beginning, they can really keep track of all of the documents, all of the costs, all of these things that I've been kind of warning you about, and make it much less intimidating. So it's good to have that conversation about what you need to do to be able to work with your finance department and have those materials uh, ready to go and those resources available.
Thanks. Looks like we have a question from Sophia. Appreciate the presentation. Thanks. I'm curious, are there any tips you have specifically for folks who are writing a grant for the first time? Yes, I would say make sure that you have all the team members together and make sure that your project is, you've really thought through your project and all the things you're going to need to fund in order to get it done. I feel like grant writing really fundamentally is good project planning. And once you've got that plan in place, then you can go after funds. You might have to, sometimes you're really lucky and you can ask for one grant to cover all the costs. If not, then think about what kind of grants pair well together. Um, you can make sure you reach out to agency staff and ask them questions. You know, it does happen where agency staff won't really want to talk to you during an open application window. But for the most part, I feel like they're really helpful and they will answer your questions. They'll typically have their contact information on their website. If they're offering like grant prep webinars, try and listen into them or get the recordings so that you know what you need to do your application. For government grants, typically they will put their scoring criteria posted in their request for proposals, which is great. It's like you totally know exactly how you're going to get graded ahead of time. So a lot of times what I'll do with organizations is actually we'll have somebody write the like a draft grant and then we'll score it. We'll actually score it ourselves and see how well is this scoring and what do we feel like we need to add to make that stronger. I hope that helps answer your question. Feel free to ask any follow-ups.
Okay, and there was also a question in the webinar chat. Do you suggest any tools, templates, maybe using Excel to track grant progress funding when a centralized grant tracking system is not available?
So are you asking tracking potential opportunities or tracking grant awards that you already have gotten? Awards you've already
Award. Oh
received.
yeah, okay, so
Yeah. So Glenn, I'm gonna let you maybe take a swing at that first and then I can add.
I I'm a, if you're, especially if you're a good Excel user, I think Excel can be really good because you can add cells or fields to Excel to keep track of, different projects. You can make notes about where invoices are, etc. One thing to keep in mind if you're keeping track of your grant on an Excel sheet, and remember, you can link the financial data with when reports are due. You can have that on the same sheet. You can have the same sheet indicate project progress. But remember, when you do that with the financial end, when you get that closeout, your tracking on that Excel sheet has to be synced with the agency's general ledger and has to be reconciled with that. In other words, it's not just enough that you said this amount was spent. Frequently, the funding source is going to want to look at the agency's uh, records to make sure that you're reporting what is also reported in the records. So again, make sure that you're periodically getting reports from your finance department and meeting with them about any discrepancies between what you've got reported and what they have. If you wait until the closeout, especially with a long grant, you're going to find yourself running around looking for documents, and it's very high pressure because you've probably already got that appointment set for when they're going to come in and do the closeout on it.
Other questions?
we gotta thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Ryan.
Well, one thing I really want to just emphasize is, we were focusing on the kinds of things that you should avoid, but I hope I don't haven't said anything to intimidate or make anyone think that this is too hard, too big a deal. You could do it right. There are a lot of folks have done this successfully, and as Adrian pointed out earlier, a lot of times these agencies, especially some of the state agencies, they want to get the money out the street. They want to see these projects done. They will help you. It's perfectly okay. And certainly neither Adrian or I were born knowing this. It's perfectly okay to call and ask for help, either from the agency, from peers, from people in your agency, or use our contact number.
Yeah. And once you get your grant award, you're going to have a grant manager assigned to you from the agency. Again, they want to see you be successful. They're there to help you try and get a good rapport going with them. Um, you can ask for extensions if you need them. I say don't go into writing a grant thinking, oh, well, we'll just get an extension. But it is possible to do that in order to make sure that you are completing the whole project. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We super appreciate you listening in. We will have these resources posted on our website. You'll get an email after the fact, pointing you in that direction. Look at the tip sheet, reach out to us if you have any other questions, and we look forward to hearing how things go. I find that some of the key projects in a city maybe aren't geared towards writing grants like parking lots, but there are a lot of projects that you have that you'd like to get done that can be a great fit for grants, and it can be a useful funding source to tap into when you're ready.
Please complete the survey, and thank you for attending.
Yeah, and I think Nancy will drop that in the chat one more time if people want to click on that. And we super appreciate you joining us. Thank you.